Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're meeting with Martyn Pitman. Martyn was formerly consultant obstetrician and gynaecologist at the Royal County Hospital in Winchester from 2003. And he had a specialist interest in high-risk obstetrics, fetal and maternal medicine, labour ward leadership and fetal monitoring. Martyn was known for supporting informed maternal choice decades before the Ockenden report supported such changes, and he was aggressively opposed to the midwifery-led normalisation agenda, which has been implicated in every maternity scandal in the UK. With flawless appraisals, consultant of choice for most of the hospital staff and their families who gave birth, as well as the consultant of choice for staff in neighbouring trusts, he was dismissed in March 2023. What went wrong? Today, we're really pleased to have you along, Martyn, so that we can hear your story. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me and for giving my story a platform. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, and very good to meet you, Martyn. Thanks very much for coming along today. So, as we've just heard, you were born in Winchester Hospital. Your children were born in Winchester. Yes.
One was born.
For the best part of... Right.
Yeah, our second daughter was born in Winchester. Our first one was I was working in London when Emma, our first daughter, was born. So she was born at the Chelsea in Westminster, but Charlotte, our youngest, was born in Winchester. Yeah.
Thank you. And you worked there for the best part of 2 decades. So what went wrong?
It's a very long story. The issue about... I think I'm fairly unique in landing what was my dream consultant post in the hospital where I was born, serving the community where I was brought up, educated, and undertook the first part of my formative training in obstetrics and gynaecology, and where I've lived now for over 40 years. So I think that's fairly unique. I don't think I've ever met another consultant who was fortunate enough to get a consultant post in the hospital where they were born and grew up. It was my dream job. Throughout my training, when I was fortunate to get on a middle grade, a registrar training rotation to Wessex, I rotated between 3 hospitals: Winchester, Basingstoke and Southampton. And Winchester at that time punched well above its weight in maternity care and obstetrics, which was my first love, really, professionally. So it was always my ambition and aim to get a job there. And the stars aligned, fate played its hand, and I was fortunate to sort of finish my training with the requisite specialist interest to get the job there. So applied and it was the proudest, happiest day of my professional life, really, to get my dream job. And that was how it was really for the first decade, really, probably, of my period of consultant tenure. I was incredibly dedicated to my role, devoted to my patients, made, I think, vast levels of personal sacrifice to provide what I thought was optimal levels and standards of care to my patients, and I was very proud of that, and was commended for the sort of outcomes that we got. So I sort of augmented the already excellent reputation that the unit had at Winchester for its obstetric and gynaecological care, and I was very proud to have played a part in that, and particularly in my areas of specialist interest, particularly with providing safe care on the labour ward, and particularly around fetal monitoring and minimising the risk of babies being damaged by the labour process, and also mums being injured or worse during labour. So I think I had objective evidence of success in what I felt were the most important parts of my job. But part of that made me vulnerable in that I steadfastly believed and still believe that in the 21st century in the UK, one of the main principles of maternity care should be to offer and provide truly evidence-based, safe care to mums. And in that regard, for 2 decades, I supported issues like maternal request cesarean sections where mums were properly medically informed and opted not to labour and to deliver by cesarean section. And I supported that way before the Ockenden report or the series of maternity scandals, against pretty fierce local and national opposition, where there was a huge pressure to normalise birth, demedicalise it, and to in a way force mothers to deliver vaginally when perhaps it wasn't in their or sometimes the baby's best interest. And that resistance of normalisation, I think, made me vulnerable to attack and perhaps to what eventually then panned out. Our trust merged, or I think most people from the Winchester end of that merger would feel it was a pretty aggressive takeover with a neighbouring trust about a decade ago. And it was fairly evident from the moment that the merger took place. I'd worked in Basingstoke, the trust that we merged with, for 2.5 years as a registrar, so I knew both the unit very well. I knew how its maternity unit was run and their ethos of care, which was poles apart from Winchester, and I knew some of the personalities involved. So I was deeply hesitant about the effect that would have on the service at Winchester, and I feared that our service would be adversely affected and would be degraded by the merger with Basingstoke. And I didn't keep that a secret. And it was fairly evident really from quite early on when the merger took place that the management structure was going to be imposed from the Basingstoke end. There was very much this view that what we do in Basingstoke is the way to go, and anything you do in Winchester was second rate, and certainly from clinical outcomes, particularly in maternity, we have very good evidence that wasn't the case. But it was non-negotiable. It was basically do things the Basingstoke way or else, and that was pretty evident. From the midwifery perspective, the management of our department was imposed by a group of senior non-clinical midwifery managers from Basingstoke, and that was, I think, my own view now, was where things started to fall down, because these individuals were all close friends. So you had a head of midwifery who was the second head of midwifery who was appointed after the merger, and she managed to basically promote all of her best friends to be her midwifery managerial lieutenants. So there were minimal chances of promotion from the Winchester midwifery staff, which was very difficult. They became very disillusioned. Pretty radical cuts in midwifery staffing levels were made. Sickness rates increased. The midwives at the Winchester end had no faith at all in their management. They didn't feel they had anybody to go to with problems, and that was where I kind of came in, because I had, I think throughout my consultant tenure, a very close working relationship with the clinical midwives, and they knew that if they felt strongly about something and they brought it to me, and if I agreed, that I would take that on. So I was pleased. I felt privileged, if you like, to act as their professional spokesperson. So when things started to deteriorate and reached the worst point, where as a consultant body, in addition to the midwifery concerns, we felt that it was starting to feel like we weren't working in a consultant-led unit anymore. Big decisions were being made without our input or even consultation. And then I had the midwives coming to me very regularly, sometimes senior midwives in tears, saying, can you do something? And it was very evident that this was a potent combination of factors that we as a consultant group, particularly the ones of us that did mainly obstetrics, had no doubt that if we didn't intervene, this was going to adversely affect both the standards of patient care, but also their safety. So in the spring of 2019, I undertook what I felt then and staunchly believe now, even after all of this, was my basic professional responsibility, according to everything you're told as a doctor, everything that's in the GMC best practice guidelines. I raised concerns. I whistleblew. I sat down with our head of service, who then was the director of midwifery, one evening, and I raised a series of concerns principally about staff and patient safety. And they were pretty crunchy issues. It led up to and included the potential, I felt, having had discussions with individual and groups of midwives, that there was a distinct possibility of a vote of no confidence in the management of our department, which I didn't want to happen. So that was how it all started. So I on Thursday evening in March of 2019, I sat down with the head of midwifery and raised concerns, and everything really that came upon my career after that resulted from that probably 45-minute hour meeting that evening.
So
I had no...
At that point, Martyn, were you feeling, reasonably confident about your job and your role? Did you feel secure in the
absolutely.
position?
I totally. I continued then to love my job. It was becoming increasingly challenging because of the stresses that we were under, because there've been the cutbacks in staff. Our ability to provide what we felt was safe care was being challenged increasingly. So you were being expected to maintain standards with less resource and less staffing. And at some point, anybody, however good your working systems are, there's going to be a realization that at some point that isn't going to work. And it was really from the clinical perspective as an obstetrician, it was at the point where, when you're going in on a day-to-day basis and there are women that you realise need to be delivered, so you've booked ladies for induction and then you come in and you've made a decision to induce somebody the night before, so that's bringing on the labour, because there are concerns either about them and or their baby, and you find that the induction was delayed because there weren't enough midwives. And if I did a couple of cesarean section lists a week, and it almost got to the point where it was the rule rather than the exception that you come in the morning, and the cesarean section lists operated on a pretty tight, they're like a theatre list. You have a dedicated team, so you have an anaesthetist and a whole team of people there ready to do the list. And you tended to have 3 cases that you would do back to back, and that was pretty tight for one session. So it was dependent on you getting in early, getting the patients consented, anaesthetists doing their stuff and cracking on, and it became almost the rule rather than the exception that you get in, and it would be, you can't start the cesarean sectionist because you don't have enough midwives. So it's really the combination of those 2 things, and realising on a day-to-day basis that there were things happening which were basically far from ideal clinically, that demonstrated an ongoing and real risk to patient safety, that made us think this has now reached the point that we have to do something about it. But I did what I thought I had a responsibility to do as a senior clinician, as a senior consultant. I had no option. It would have been completely inappropriate and unwise of me to have not intervened, because had the service have deteriorated and then we had outcomes, and if I was questioned, I've known about this for 6 months but I haven't done anything about it, then that could, in its own right, bizarrely, have posed risks to me as a clinician, because you could have been accused of, why, if you knew there were these concerns, why didn't you act on them? Your failure to raise concerns could then have led to criticism. So I didn't for 1 minute take a step back and think, no, I can't do this. I can't. I didn't consider that. So many people have asked me subsequent to it, and particularly in view of what happened, you must regret what you did. No, I don't. I don't regret what I had. No professional option but to do what I did. Of course, I regret how it panned out. I'll go to my deathbed, whenever that is, forever regretting what I've had to sacrifice for doing what was my basic professional duty in whistleblowing and raising concerns. But I don't regret the act of what I did. I did it with the right intention.
Yeah, I can see that. So, Martyn, what did you think was going to happen when you spoke up that first time?
I had absolutely no perception, David, of what would happen. I mean, the event wasn't that unusual. At the time it happened, I viewed the director of midwifery not as just a managerial colleague, but I actually viewed her as a friend. It wasn't unusual for us to have that sort of meeting. It wasn't unusual for us to go out one-to-one, to go to a local pub and have a drink and chew the cud and chat about issues, about challenges, about things that had arisen that we needed to address. So the actual event, to me at the time, wasn't that unusual. I completely perceived that the magnitude of what I had to say was going to be a challenge. And I warned the individual before I even started saying them that you're going to find some of this hard to hear. But I had absolutely no perception at all that when I went into work that day, and when I walked into the individual's office that evening, of the potential ramifications of what was going to happen. What did I think would happen? Well, that individual had two choices, David. She had the choice to do the appropriate thing, which would have been to have listened and to have taken a step back and thought, actually, this guy is experienced. I hope she respected me. I'm pretty sure she did respect me at that time as a clinician. And she realised that it wasn't just me saying this. This wasn't just me being belligerent and acting unilaterally. I was there as a spokesperson for most of the clinicians in our department. So she had two choices. She could and should have done the appropriate thing, which was to listen and to have called a meeting with maybe the senior clinical midwives and the consultants to thrash this out and to devise changes in practice that would have addressed our problems. The alternative option, which is the one that she took, is that, and a lot of people have asked me to summarise what happened to you in one sentence, and basically I dared to challenge an individual and a management strategy that were both unprepared and unwilling to be challenged. And in doing so, I threatened individual managerial and organisational reputation, which tragically those individuals, and it ascended right through the trust, right up to the very pinnacle, exactly as is now, of course, being seen in the post office crisis. And they individually and collectively decided that they weren't prepared to have their reputation individually and as an organisation sullied, even if that was happening for the potential benefit of patient safety. So the choice that individual took, and the senior management following on from her took, was that it was far better for them and for the organisation to take out the messenger. So I was expendable. So if we ignore what we're being told and we just take out the person that's telling it to us, which is what tragically they decided to do, and that, to my astonishment, as the months and years progressed, it became increasingly evident that that was the approach they were taking. Now, of course, they would argue that that wasn't the case. No, we did listen and we did amend things, and we didn't. And the whole argument, both before and after the employment tribunal, is that we didn't and we never would dismiss anybody for whistleblowing. But anybody who knows what actually happened and the truth behind it will know that there is a distinct difference between their recollection and what actually happened in reality. And the timeline also, which was sort of glossed over and ignored by the employment tribunal, is condemning in that regard. There is no way that what happened to me would have happened if I hadn't have whistleblown. So,
thank you. So if I get the picture right, Martyn, you had conversations with colleague midwives, then you had the meeting you've described with the senior midwife who you thought you had a reasonable relationship with, and from that point on, what happened exactly?
Well, the meeting was very strange. Normally, I'd actually warn my wife the morning of the meeting that I've got this meeting this evening. I'll be late, and that was basically because when I'd had meetings with this individual before, it normally degenerated into not degenerated. It normally progressed into a fairly positive but quite heated debate about all of the issues. This meeting was very different, though. Every point that I raised hardly provoked any reaction, and I'd gone into it. I don't, in a meeting of this magnitude, I don't go into it unprepared. So I'd taken a sheet of A4 paper with bullet points on it in increasing magnitude, terminating with the bits about the vote of no confidence issue. And I remember being very surprised because as I raised every point, hardly anything came back, and I thought, this is really weird. And we got to the point of being quite uncomfortable. And I, hand on heart, conducted that meeting in the same way I'm speaking to you. I didn't, despite what was thrown at me in the disciplinary investigation and the employment tribunal, I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't banging on the table. I wasn't threatening. I didn't block the exit to the office or any of the other astonishing accusations that were thrown at me. I stayed balanced and calm throughout. But the meeting did end with the individual getting emotional and leaving her office, which was wholly out of character. So I drove home afterwards thinking that was bizarre, thinking, well, I wouldn't have predicted that. And then for a few weeks after that, there was this sense that things were a bit odd. The primary thing that happened was that neither the individual involved nor any of her managerial colleagues were seen at Winchester hardly at all for the next few weeks, which was unusual. And then a few things happened that I thought that was a bit odd. Are they attempting to sort of catch me out? Particularly there was a guideline meeting where I'd written a new guideline about fetal monitoring. And normally those guidelines, and I knew it was going to be contentious, but it was basically based on new evidence that had arisen where I felt if we made fairly minimal changes to what we offer expectant parents with regard to how their babies are monitored in the build up to and in the entrance into labour, we could potentially detect at that point undetected high risk babies. But I knew it was going to be contentious, and I knew again it would be against the normalisation culture of the management of the midwife. So with the assistance of a senior midwifery colleague, I rewrote this guideline, and it was presented in a meeting. Normally in those guidelines meetings, you maybe get about half a dozen staff. And in this one, which followed on shortly after the whistleblowing event, the room was packed. Must have been 40 people present with, and interestingly, the director of midwifery and a couple of her colleagues were there, and a whole load of the senior midwives from Basingstoke, which was highly unusual. And it was the most hostile, aggressive and unprofessional assault, really, of any consultant I've ever witnessed in my career, which was bizarre. And it was witnessed by several of my newly appointed Winchester consultants who were there sort of wide-eyed thinking, what on earth is going on? Thankfully, it was one of those events, and I'm sure we've all had them in our lives, where you have the devil sat on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and the devil was saying, don't take all this aggression and react, and the angel on the other side was saying, no, you're being set up. Just don't react to any of this. And thankfully, the angel won, and I realised not that far through the meeting that this had all been set up. This was a 3-line whip to provoke a reaction that would then give them more weight in their argument against me. So it was just futile to try and challenge a group that had been pre-prepared to make this as difficult for me as I possibly could. So I remember just thinking, oh, this is pointless, and just sat down and didn't respond to it. And it was that night, which isn't a coincidence, that night that I received an email invitation from the then Chief Medical Officer to meet to discuss, quote unquote, the communication challenges that have been brought to my attention about what's going on in your department. And that wasn't a coincidence. That the plan had been hatched by then, by the senior midwifery team, that they weren't prepared to accept the criticism. They weren't going to address the startlingly obvious issues in our department. But what they were going to do was to convert this into an attempt to take out the messenger, to take out me, and that was basically how things all started. So it was a distinctly uncomfortable feeling for a few weeks after the whistleblowing event, which I now realise I wasn't just being paranoid. There were processes underway that were designed to potentially strengthen the narrative against me, and thankfully I didn't rise to them, but in the eventuality, it didn't make any difference. So what unfolded then, that meeting I was invited to, I couldn't go to. And then there were some clinical events that happened the weekend after that, which kind of backed up my argument about the monitoring. And I think those events made my complainants, because I think at that point it would have been potentially possible to have got us all into a room together and to have done what was blindingly obvious, which was basically get all of the antagonists in a room and to mediate and to chat all this through. And then I don't think anybody who was involved with this, what happened to me from day one until my career demise and dismissal, would disagree that there was a potential at that point to have prevented anything that unfolded from happening by just getting us into a room and discussing it. And I think it was the events of that week that led to my eventual complainants deciding, no, we don't want to go down that route, we want to get him out, which was why they then, the following week, converted an expression of concern into a formal grievance and a complaint of bullying, intimidation, undermining behaviour, which was what I was then presented with. So the whole thing was turned around about against me as being the problem maker.
Martyn, what was that like for you to be depicted? What was it like for you to be depicted as a troublemaker, a bully, the problem? I know you'd had an exemplary career before then, so what was it like to find yourself being portrayed in that way?
It was an incredible, almost unbelievable experience, Naomi. And it was made worse by the fact that the initial meeting I was invited to, I couldn't go to because coincident with that, I was in a meeting in the Midlands, so I couldn't go to it. So I politely declined, saying I'd be very happy to meet with you on another day. Nothing came of that, to the point that I actually thought, oh, this is all going to go away. And then on a Wednesday, I was just about to leave work on a Wednesday a few weeks later, and I always had a habit of checking my emails before I went home. And I had an email from the chief medical officer's personal assistant to say, and it was all very jovial almost. Sort of, hi Martyn, hope you're okay. I've been asked to set up a meeting with you. I know it's a short notice on the coming Friday, to discuss the communication issues. It was 4:30 on the Friday evening, which I now know was deliberate. It's really important that you attend. So I by then had already sort of set up a link with the BMA, my union, because I was concerned about the way this was going, and they'd given me, spot on advice. They said, if any meetings are set up, the first thing you ask is for written evidence about what the concerns are, what the allegations are against you. And the second thing you ask is this meeting formal or informal? And they said, as soon as the F word is mentioned, formal, you say, right, okay, I want to be represented. So as soon as I had that in the back of my mind, I read this invitation and thought, this is exactly what the BMA said would happen. So I emailed back and said, would it be possible, please, to put the allegations against me and the concerns in writing? And can you confirm whether the meeting's formal and informal? Almost as soon as I pressed send, my mobile went, and it was this individual, the chief medical officer's PA, on the phone saying, and again, it was very, very jovial. It was, oh, hi, Martyn. Thanks for getting back to me so quickly. Or I've discussed about the evidence, and the CMO's decided that they don't want you to see the evidence before this meeting. So I said, well, that's a bit unusual. And then it was the next bit that started to ring alarm bells, because it was, and I said, oh, what about, is the meeting formal or informal? And there was a hesitation in the voice. And it was, no, the meeting is informal, but you might want to bring a colleague with you. Okay. So again, even then, I didn't really think much of it. I thought, well, this is okay. And it was going to be chaired by somebody I'd never met. So it was an individual who was a divisional director, so quite a high up. She was a doctor, a high up medical manager, but in another division. I'd never met this individual. So in my naivety, I thought, well, this is quite positive. They want somebody outside of our department to listen to what's going on, and we can make good of it. So I asked an anaesthetic colleague of mine, are you free on Friday afternoon? Yes, that's fine, I'll come along. So I trundled across the car park, quite not having a clue what I was walking into. So I didn't even know where the office was and where the meeting was going to be held, because I'd never had any sort of disciplinary issues before. So I waited outside the office. The divisional medical director arrived along with the PA that had sent the invite. So it was formal. It was sort of introductions, handshakes, went into the room. And as soon as I crossed the threshold of the office, I looked at this circular table in the office, and there were beautifully presented and laid out plasticized folders. And I thought, this doesn't look or feel very informal to me. So we sat down, and it was the start of that meeting was all we've timetabled this meeting, Martyn, because we've received formal complaints about you, and as of I'm just telling you now that you are under formal investigation. So I said, well, hold on, and I looked at the PA and said, I specifically asked you if this meeting was formal. Why did you lie to me? And she looked, understandably on the spot. Oh, I didn't. I meant the meeting was informal, but not the process behind it was. And of course, I could have just said, thanks very much, I'm going until I have my BMA rep. I didn't, and I'm probably pleased in a way that I didn't, because I would then, and of course it was deliberately staged, which then became a repeating strategy throughout the subsequent years of doing these things late on a Friday afternoon, which initially I thought, well, that's just not very convenient. But of course that was deliberate, because they knew I couldn't contact the BMA after the meeting to seek advice. So I had the whole weekend with this package of astonishing documentation, which could, and I suppose you could argue did, represent the end of my career, and wasn't in a position to be able to contact anybody to gain assistance. So, and the meeting was bizarre. It was pretty pressurized. It was, oh, here are the terms of reference to your investigation. Can you sign these? And not a chance. I'm not signing anything. They had been deliberately worded to try and catch me out, in as much as the third term of reference was deliberately worded to make it look as if I'd already been given several warnings about my behaviour, which I hadn't. And the whole thing was very, very threatening, to the point that, and probably the worst bit, and I think the bit that I found most challenging, which I'm sure, given your interest in this area, won't come as any surprise to you, is just before I was about to leave the office, I was told that it was going to be a formal investigation, have a case investigator, and then a case manager, and the process will take 6 weeks, and there'll be a report, and then there'll be a decision about whether any sanctions need to be imposed, and then. So I remember asking about, well, what happens? Do I continue working in the interim, and that will be discussed with you with occupational health, and we made an appointment for you to see them on Monday. And then I remember saying, so can you just tell me best and worst scenarios here? But because I hadn't read any of the documentation at that point, but I remember saying, the best. I don't go into the worst scenario, because I obviously know what that will represent. But the best scenario is if all this is disproved, what happens? And I remember the individual who then played a critical role in the management of my case said, oh, and I distinctly remember her face, and it was almost as if, well, that isn't going to happen, is it? It was sort of, well, in the event of that happening, then that would need to be looked at. And I remember picking up the paperwork, looking at my colleague, thinking, oh my God. And then just as I was about to leave the office, almost as a flippant flyaway comment at the end, which was probably the most damaging aspect of what then unfolded in the first stage of this, was the flyaway comment, oh, by the way, you're forbidden to speak to anybody in the trust about any of this. And if we find out that you have, that will go against you. Because, of course, the first thing I wanted to do was to sit down with my immediate colleagues and say, you will not believe what has just happened. So the professional isolation that imposed, and the vulnerability that comes with that, was profound. And of course, the further the thing went on, it became perfectly obvious that my complainants weren't adhering, or I presume they probably hadn't even been told the same. So it was pretty obvious that they were colluding and discussing things. But I was supposed to sit at home, not knowing what the heck was going on, and to completely avoid any contact with the very people that you would be looking to support you through what was, the most challenging event of my career.
So a number of things that you're talking about, Martyn, which just sound really familiar from lots of other people's stories. The idea of being summoned to an informal meeting, but then finding when you're there that it's formal, and then of course people not having adequate preparation or support to cope with that, and feeling a bit railroaded. But also that process of being ostracised, whilst you're potentially being spoken about quite widely in a very denigrating way, with this assumption of no smoke without a fire, whilst you're isolated and not able to even get support from the people around you who would know what it meant to be accused of the things that you were accused of. So horrible, really horrible story to hear. It's awful.
And also the other thing as well, which I now know is very typical of this, is the gaslighting that goes on behind the scenes. Probably behind closed doors, maybe not in groups, but individuals, about people being told stuff about me and what I'd done that was so completely untrue. So yeah, it was incredibly isolating. It was incredibly damaging, and I didn't.
Well, it's such a problem. Sorry, there's a slight lag, but it's such a prominent part of the picture. It's hard to see that just being sort of natural gossip, because quite often these accounts seem to include fabrications about people's behaviour that's deliberately designed to undermine their character, assassinate their character to their colleagues.
And the interesting thing was, initially nobody was told anything in the department. So of course that can carry on for a certain amount of time without people sort of thinking, well, hold on, what is going on? If you're away for a week, people will think, oh, he's probably just gone on holiday, or he's on a course, but we didn't know about it. Even for 2 weeks, the same. But then when it goes beyond that, and they start to then reschedule clinics and stuff, then people start asking questions. And of course, if you're not honest with people and tell them the truth, and I think hospitals are particularly bad for this, then gossip spreads. And it was quite it didn't take very long. It was several months after the initial event. There was some pretty horrendous gossip going around about what had happened, involving there were startling things about affairs and marriage breakups, and there was another one that was circulating about me being off because I was having cancer treatment. And you say, hold on, this is so. By the trust not being honest about what was going on, it then propagated some quite astonishing rumours about what actually was going on. And when they start to filter back to you via the most bizarre routes, you start to think this is, and you're right, how much of that was deliberate? Because a lot of, again, having been in contact with numerous whistleblowers since what happened to me, it's generic what happens. There is a playbook, a textbook that organised, and NHS trusts certainly aren't unique in this. There is a playbook that is mapped out, almost as if senior managers go on a course. And if you have a troublemaker, particularly a whistleblower, this is what you need to do. And a significant part of that is about disruption. It is about how can we make this as uncomfortable for this individual as we possibly can, with the hope that they will buckle or worse. And that's why you don't have to look very far in the field of whistleblowing to see not just the career destruction that is wrecked through it, but the life destruction and the people that have taken their own lives through it, which is just astonishing. But I get it.
And you're half joking about this training course that they can go on, but I know that there are lawyers that run courses for HR in terms of telling them how to manage these kind of situations in ways that are, cause you to shudder, really, because it's not ethical practices. But you subsequently went to an employment tribunal, didn't you, to challenge the trust? What happened there?
Well, that all came about because to cut a very long and painful story short, the 6-week investigation period for my initial, what was called maintaining high professional standards investigation, as my BMA rep warned me, my first meeting with her, she said, this won't be 6 weeks. It'll probably be at least a year, which was a hideous thing to hear. But she was absolutely right, and actually went way over a year. This all started in May of 2019, and I wasn't permitted to go back to my full clinical role at Winchester until late September 2020. So that was how long it went on for. And not all of that delay was the trust's fault, which because of the damage that the process caused me, I was forced into a depressive crisis, really, in the winter of 19 into 20, needing GP, psychologist and psychiatric input, and without any sort of past history of that. I required therapeutic medication intervention, which I'm not embarrassed to say. I challenge anybody, even on the most stable medical footing, not to potentially go down that route. It was partly because it was just this spiral of me thinking this is so unfair, I've got to challenge this. So I was burning every sort of hour available to investigate what should have happened, the law and everything, and I just my brain was frazzled. But the accusations against me were, the terms of reference were not upheld, which the trust challenged astonishingly right up to and including in the employment tribunal, because it didn't really fit their narrative. But the end of the report, the 3 terms of reference were not upheld. The trust clearly weren't prepared to accept that because they wanted their pound of flesh. So I had to go on an advanced communication course, which I then duly did. And I had to go through mediation with my remaining complainants because 2 of them had resigned and left the trust by the time this point had happened, which I did. So I ended up getting back to work, and it was within 2 weeks of resuming my previous role, it became absolutely stark obvious that the trust senior management were determined to make life as difficult as they possibly could. So I was monitored invasively. Every single interaction I had, every telephone call, every on-call I did, every practical procedure I did, every operation was being monitored. And if there was anything possible that could be used against me, there was a hierarchical tier of referral up to the very top of the organisation management. So everything was recorded, which I found out when disclosure in the employment tribunal came. So when this and that process culminated with me being basically blamed for a surgical complication at a middle grade when I was on call. I had no idea this individual was doing a procedure, caused a significant complication, and I was kind of blamed for it. And as a result of that, I had the astonishing claim that I was no longer capable or safe to do my job anymore, with no evidence. So, and I tried to challenge it, and my challenge was rebuffed. So I had the situation then that I was on call, having been a consultant for then 18 years, with not a single complication or problem that I caused through being on call. I was then told that you're not capable and safe to do that anymore. So because of the problem it would have caused the department if they stopped me doing the on-calls, I was still allowed to do it, but they paid for another consultant to be on call as well, which was effectively downgrading me to a registrar. So all this is going on. The BMA were massively supportive, and they were aghast at what the trust were doing, and they supported me to go down a legal route. So we put in a grievance. So I went through a grievance appeal. And then in July 21, which was billed to be my grievance appeal conclusion meeting, which the chief executive chaired, the grievance appeal was pretty much kicked into touch, even though the non-executive director who had done the grievance appeal found what he thought, a guy with an enormous amount of HR experience, thought there were significant deficiencies in how the trust had handled my case. It was all sort of kicked into touch. And the chief executive said at the end of the meeting that there were 2 other concerns she wished to raise with me. One of them was that a committee that, ironically, I had advised the trust to form in a meeting that I had with the chief executive back in I think it was November 2019, when I realised what a mess their management of my case had been. And the chief executive asked me, have you got any suggestions? And I said, well, yeah, I would advise you get an external agency in to advise you how you manage disciplinary investigation. And also I would advise you to form a committee so that when complaints about members of staff are received, they kind of get assessed by a committee of wise individuals, and you decide whether they are worth pursuing down a formal route or whether they should be downgraded, if you like. That committee was then formed, and that very committee had been convened and had recommended to the chief executive that, or had stated that in their opinion, my relationship with the senior management in the trust had, in their opinion, irretrievably broken down, and they actually recommended that the chief executive should dismiss me. Now that stepped way out of the remit or the terms of reference of that committee. And then to my astonishment, if that wasn't bad enough, I was then accused, and this is where the whole, I'm sure you guys are aware, but in whistleblowing management, there's this process called DARVO, where the organisation deny your accusation. They then accuse you of the same, and so DA, and attack you, the other A, and then they manage fairly naively, in my case, to reverse the victim and offender, the RVO part of DARVO. So the chief executive then accused me, so my potential return to the department, as posing a significant quote unquote risk to patient safety. So the whole thing had been turned around from me raising concerns to me then being a risk to patient safety. So I remember that whole meeting had been so bizarre that I actually burst out laughing and said, "Sorry, what objective evidence have you got to back up that astonishing accusation against me?" Because something that I never even raised when I was still practicing, but I do now because I will never go back to practice, and I'm incredibly proud of it. In that, in 30 years of operating in one of the highest risk medical professions in obstetrics, I never had, to my knowledge, a single clinical adverse incident that was caused by my obstetric management, which I think is pretty unusual. So to be accused by your chief executive of being a risk to patient safety was so bizarre. So I asked then, and I'm still waiting now, over 3 years later, for the evidence that supported that astonishing accusation. So from that moment on, the BMA then said, well, you can't expect Martyn to come back and work in an NHS trust when the chief executive of that trust has accused him of being a risk to your patients. So they asked for the evidence as well, and we waited and we never got it. So a legal team was commissioned by the BMA, and then we put in two claims to the Employment Tribunal for whistleblower persecution, the first one, which was heard last September. And had that have been successful, the natural progression of that would have been unfair dismissal on the basis of whistleblowing, but that was never heard because, astonishingly, the Employment Tribunal basically dismissed. They dismissed. It's quite difficult to put into words what they did conclude. To my credit, the panel, the judge, actually did admit that I was a whistleblower, which is quite an achievement, and there was an admission that I had suffered detriment, which was quite hard to deny, bearing in mind I'd lost my career. But I think to everybody's astonishment who knew what had happened, and particularly those people who actually either came to or online watched the Employment Tribunal, the panel failed to agree that the detriments were caused by my protected disclosures. So because that failed, the whole thing was kicked into touch, which was the most incredibly astonishing experience, really. I kind of, in my naivety, thought that the battle was to actually get these individuals into a UK legal court. My wife and I drove down to Southampton on the first day of the Employment Tribunal, and there was I was nervous. I didn't have a clue what to expect, really. I knew it was going to be tough. I knew it would be challenging, but I genuinely thought that fair justice is going to come from this. You get into a UK court, and of course the legal system is going to protect, and it's going to be fair, and it's going to be appropriately conducted. And it was as far from that as it could possibly have been. I will never ever comprehend how the judgment that came out reflected the evidence that was presented and the way the whole process was managed, which is gravely concerning. But when you're going into a legal system where I could have challenged I could have put in an appeal, but when you're told by your own legal team, who were ebullient in their positivity at the end of the hearing, so much so that they were talking about how much I'd be willing to accept as a remedy and celebrating their success, and then you're told 6 weeks later by the same people that there's no point in appealing because you won't be able to prove that there was an error in the law. And the judgment, pretty much in every paragraph, you can say, well, that doesn't reflect the evidence and the fact that was presented. But of course, nothing's recorded. So, I read the 70-odd pages of the judgment, thought, well, that's not true, that didn't happen, that wasn't what was said. How can you possibly accept the evidence of the trust when it was clear that, at best, that evidence was disingenuous, and that's being polite? So I went back to my legal team and said, well, I can challenge it on fact. And how are you going to do that? Well, anybody who was there knows that yeah, but you can't use their evidence, isn't legally admissible. And there was a legal trainee that was appointed by my team who was typing all of the proceedings out. And I said, well, can I have her transcript? Yes, you can have a transcript. What are you going to do? I'll use that. No, you can't. You can't use that. That's not admissible either. So the proceedings weren't recorded. They weren't taped. So the only legally admissible document from what happened is, guess what? The judge's own notes. And as a complainant, you have no legal right to access the judge's notes. So the whole thing is completely stacked against you. And of course, the tragedy, or was it not a coincidence? That system of not recording employment tribunals ended 2 weeks after my hearing. So now all employment tribunal hearings have to be recorded. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. So I will never be able to get my head around how I lost, how a case that should have been absolutely black and white became anything but. But it took me 5 years to get where I got. Had I have appealed, it would have been at least another 5 years, and it would probably have been both personally and financially devastating if I'd decided to get with minimal chance of anything that would have approached representing a victory to me. So the whole...
I know. I think people get very caught up in kind of like David and Goliath and wanting justice, don't they? But actually, it's like, how can you win when so much is stacked against you? But Martyn, when you were talking, you can really hear your pride at having been the kind of obstetrician that you were, and the fact that you have this exemplary record behind you. How's it affected your identity to lose your profession in this way?
It's been huge. It's been devastating. I never, in the 20 years that I was a consultant, I didn't expect, and I never got any thanks or praise from the trust management. Never, despite, as you said in your introduction, despite being sort of the go-to trusted obstetrician by the majority of staff to look after them and their partners, babies, GPs, never got any thanks. So, and I enjoyed an incredible position. It was an absolute honour to undertake the job that I did. And I did a presentation at the RSM last week, and I put a picture up of one of the last babies I ever delivered. And I said, I can distinctly remember delivering that baby just before my career ended, and I had as much pride and amazement at delivering that last baby as I did the first baby that I delivered 30 years ago. And you occupy a respected position in the community. Your friends think you do a great job, and you're admired and respected for doing it. And when all of that is wrenched away from you through, what exactly did I do? Well, I'm told I lost my job not because of what I did, what I said, but it's because the way that I said it is how I lost my career, really. So I can imagine if you lost your job through gross professional misconduct, or doing something that in the GMC's eyes was worthy of losing, I can imagine that would be devastating. But to lose one's career and everything you worked sort of 40 years of your adult life to achieve through actually doing what I still say now was my basic professional responsibility, to raise concerns, and to know that every single managerial tier in my employing trust, right up to and including the chief executive, the chair, and members of the board, were prepared to support that, and even taking it outside of the trust to the legal system, and you still for whatever reason, have no support, and nobody's going to actually know this guy was wrong. It's been incredibly difficult. And so what happens to your identity? It destroys it. It destroys a lot of your self-respect. It destroys a lot of your self-worth. And that has massive ramifications on pretty much every aspect of your being, really. And you know that the vast majority of people who know you and what you are about, your closest friends, your colleagues and things, will know the truth. And they will know that actually that isn't what happened, that isn't what you did. But then the people that don't know you that well, that read the Hampshire Chronicle, that saw the incredible coverage that the local TV put out, and then you say, oh, actually, you lost the case. And you know in your heart of hearts that they're going to think a very different side, actually, or maybe there was another side to this. And that's really hard, really hard. But I had, I wasn't a great fan of social media before all this kicked off, but it became my saviour, really. I mean, Twitter, particularly in the early stages of this, because of the professional exclusion, I suddenly thought, actually, there's a way I can gain support from other people that have been through this. So that became incredibly powerful and beneficial. And then prior to the Employment Tribunal, a wonderful ex-private patient of mine set up a Facebook support group. And that's, that in the lead up to my Employment Tribunal had 2,000 members, past patients, members of staff who were brave enough to actually declare support. And that became incredibly supportive. And knowing that the people that actually really matter in this, the people that do know you, that you've looked after and have cared for and helped through difficult pregnancies, are prepared to actually put incredibly supportive, heart-wrenching commentaries on social media was amazing. So no, the identity thing and what it does to you, I don't think I'll ever recover from the damage that's done. And that was part of my decision process about my future was based on that, because I will never get back to where I was before any of this started in 2019, because of the profound psychological damage that this has wreaked on me, but not just me, my family as well.
Yeah, a very harrowing story you've told us today, Martyn, but as Naomi's already indicated, it's one which is quite familiar to us. You use the term, I've forgotten what the term was now. Did you say it was generic?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I thought that was an interesting term to use, because it does, in a way, highlight the familiar connections between these situations which so many people have been subject to.
But I think that's absolutely right. And the meeting that I mentioned earlier on at the Royal Society of Medicine last week, which was sort of a patient safety conference, but it did have a bit of a slant towards whistleblowing. I think that's probably one of the biggest get-togethers of NHS whistleblowers that's ever happened, and it's quite astonishing when you meet other clinicians that have been through the same process, and the more you speak to them, the quite chilling similarities that are very, very evident in how NHS trusts, and this isn't in any way specific to NHS trusts. There's been a recent highly publicised case in the nuclear industry at Sellafield about a whistleblower that's been persecuted, and I'm sure it's the same in the police force, in teaching. But the more contact you have with whistleblowers, you realise two things. I think you realise that the vast majority of whistleblowers are not troublemakers. They're not difficult people, but they're quite principled, and they act because they feel they have a professional responsibility to do so, because things are happening in their employing organisation that are not right, and they have the responsibility, courage, whatever it takes, to actually, rather than just casting a blind eye to it, they have that personality trait that forces them to take action. So I've lost what I was going to say then.
You're right. I mean, there's solid research on that actually people who speak up at work aren't truculent troublemakers, but they've typically had exemplary appraisals throughout their career, and they're speaking up because it's the right thing to do, and most people seem to do it because they just think they're doing their job. They're not trying to do anything heroic.
You're reading my mind. The other thing I was going to say about the second point was that you tend to find that, and I suppose my case is an exemplar of that, in that I'd had 26 years of flawless appraisals and had passed 2 GMC revalidations with glowing colours. And the bizarre thing about that was that the most recent one was signed off by the Chief Medical Officer 2 months before my formal disciplinary investigation commenced. And when I raised that with her, and particularly the interesting thing from the GMC revalidation was, ironically, there are sections in that are based on 360-degree colleague appraisals where you're marked on your communication skills and your relationship with colleagues. And mine were almost at the top end of the grading, so the most positive things. All of the responses were in, for those 2 sections, were in the most positive marking. And when I raised this with the Chief Medical Officer and said, look, these accusations against me, if you look back at my appraisals and the GMC revalidation, which you signed, and the response I got was, your appraisals and revalidations are irrelevant to this process, Martyn. So what is the point of them? So they're irrelevant when it fits your narrative because you made a decision that my time is up and you want me out. But why do we then spend so many months of our time doing appraisals and preparing for revalidations if you are going to tell me, because 4 individuals have decided to try and make my life difficult, that the hundreds of individuals that feed into a revalidation, their opinion doesn't matter? And you find that is quite typical in my experience with whistleblowers. It isn't people that struggle through their careers or are getting held up in appraisals or not passing their revalidation. It's not them at all. It's the high performers, it seems to be, that end up becoming unstuck. So it does seem to be a certain personality of in medicine clinicians that end up in this position. So
I think that's very true, Martyn. I'm conscious of the time. We haven't got much longer left, but I suppose I did want to ask you, how have you coped in terms of getting your well-being back to, trying to recover from this process? And what advice would you give to anyone else who was caught up in this kind of thing?
Well, the first advice I would give, which I suppose you covered by saying you should practice what you preach, is whenever you're faced with this sort of thing, the most important thing is you take care of yourself, which I certainly didn't. And that also stands for your loved ones, your spouses, your family and friends, who are also troubled by it as well, because this affects way beyond the individual. I benefited. My GP was incredibly understanding. I had input from two different psychologists, and I had counselling that was organised for me through the BMA, which I found really from day one being able to and again it's back to the professional isolation. I think being able to talk about your experiences with somebody completely divorced from it, who doesn't know any of the people involved, doesn't even know what it's like working in your specialty, I found it incredibly cathartic. Not that they were necessarily saying stuff that was supportive, but it was just being able to vent, knowing that it wasn't going to go anywhere. So I think my advice would be to try and I recognised I was getting into a downward spiral and I needed help. Other people might find that a challenge, and I think that happened because I became completely pathologically obsessed with what was going on and proving my innocence. So it's critically important to take time away from it, and again, practice what you preach, because I didn't do this enough, really. Find something aside of this where you can close the door on it and do something else. my saviour has always been music. I mean, I love listening to rock music and stuff. So that was always been my go-to. Sport, find an interest, find friends that can just get you away from what is destroying the rest of your life. Find something else that enables you to switch off. But I certainly found that hard initially. I now, I suppose all major life events you learn a heck of a lot about, and one of the biggest lessons I learned was about how this works, because I had no idea how my brain worked before all of this in this regard. But I now recognise when I need to just take a step back and divert. So that was quite I think an important lesson. I think the other thing it does is that I think, when you've been through a catastrophic life event like this, it does put other things in life in perspective, really. So I think it does enable you to potentially deal with other challenges that present. When you've almost lost everything, when other things come along, you think, well, actually, that's not as bad as what I've already managed to get through. I can't sit here and pretend it's been anything other than a completely harrowing and hideous experience. But advice that I would give to other people that face this sort of thing is, first, try and avoid it, and secondly, just get support, and if help and assistance is offered, take it.
I suppose I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things there, Martyn. So I suppose one, that you're kind of talking about that growth through adversity, and there's a brilliant book by Bruce Feiler called Life is in the Transitions, which I recommend a lot to people, because it does talk about how these dark periods can really help us grow and develop and move on. But secondly, that idea of reaching out for connection, and I think there are some really great organisations doing really good work. So there's a support group run by Justice for Whistleblowers, but you yourself have kind of been working actively to create more support for not just doctors and nurses as isolated disciplines, but trying to bring people together within the NHS, I believe.
Yes, I mean, I think that a lot of that was spawned from the fact that when you have the realization that the legal system has catastrophically let you down, I wasn't, and I'm still not prepared for that to be the end of it, both from an individual basis and also from the altruistic perspective of having learned so much in this, and how things are done and the pitfalls and how you can avoid the pitfalls. A significant part of what I'm hoping to achieve now is to help others who, way before they get into the issues that I got into. So the whole Justice for Whistleblowers thing, NHS whistleblowers, and seeking and very positively getting support now from the press and media, and agreeing to take part in this podcast with you, which I'm very grateful for, is about getting the word out there. And I'm supporting other people now that are going through similar experiences. And I think people's ability to access that sort of support now is probably a lot easier than it was back in 2019, where I had to really kind of look pretty hard for it. So I think what's the article in the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago, the Times support of it, the meeting at the Royal Society of Medicine, the fact that both political parties now seem to have caught on to this on the back of the post office thing, and of course the hideous infected blood scandal thing, all of which there are so many distinct similarities in how senior people in the NHS and then in the post office acted. Back to your point about the generic nature of this, David. So I'm still seeking accountability for what happened to me by whatever route, certainly not the legal route at the moment, but also if I can assist others in similar positions in any way I possibly can, then I will view that as being the least I can do, really.
So finally, Martyn, wasn't there some issue about the CQC and a CQC inspection? Can you tell us about that, please?
the issue about so the allegations that I made, the patient safety concerns I raised, were then entirely confirmed by an unannounced CQC visit to the trust in late 2021, which then reported in early 2022, particularly around the areas of unsafe staffing levels and practices that resulted from that. So that placed the trust in a pretty challenging position, because CQC came in and essentially found everything that I had raised concerns about, but it was 3 years later. So what it demonstrated was that they had done very little at all with the concerns that I'd whistleblown about 3 years ago. And then you had the government Quango inspection agency coming in and finding exactly the same thing. So the challenge that the trust faced was actually how many babies and mums have suffered because we can't demonstrate any change in what was going on between those two time periods.
Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story, Martyn. It is really powerful, and it's just awful to hear it being spoken of in these ways.
Thank you very much.
Martyn, very good to meet you.